This week, something extraordinary is happening in Gaza. A wave of protests and demonstrations led by Gazans themselves, shouting this time not at Israel, but at Hamas. In city after city, brave civilians are risking their lives to chant, "Hamas are the terrorists." It's a stunning development. But really, is this a turning point for Gaza? We've seen this before, moments of resistance, like in early 2024, only for Hamas to regain power, crush the dissent, and retighten its grip. So the real questions are, is Hamas truly weakening from within? And will this time be different? Perhaps most importantly, is Israel prepared to take the necessary steps to ensure that it is? I'm Doron Spielman, and this is True East. Joining us today to go deep on these questions is Akiva Bigman, one of Israel's most fearless investigative journalists and commentators. He's a senior writer for both Israel Hayom and Makor Rishon, and a founder and regular contributor to Midah, Israel's leading current affairs platform for in-depth analysis. In the wake of October 7th, Akiva published what is widely considered the most comprehensive investigative report into the systemic failures that led to the massacre. His work has become essential reading for anyone trying to understand what went wrong and what must change. Today, we sit down with Akiva to unpack his findings and what this moment in Gaza could mean for Israel's future. This is True East. Let's get into it. Akiva, thank you again for joining us.
Sure, it's my pleasure, Doron.
So, Akiva, we're seeing Gazans once again protesting against Hamas, something that, just even a few years ago, before the war, would have been impossible, I think, to see Gazan people protesting against Hamas. What are you hearing from your sources about the scale and seriousness of these demonstrations? And is this a sign that maybe Hamas is weakening from within?
Yeah, so this is a very big question, and maybe the question of the war. As far as we know, this is not very widespread. We've seen certain some kind of demonstrations. I think it's maybe more online than it is actually in the streets. In some areas where the IDF has issued called the population to move out, and then the first people to move out are the Hamas activists, and therefore their grip on the population that's left is a little bit weakened. So I don't know if we can talk about like a wide-scale protest. This is not what people in democracies really want to see in totalitarian places like Gaza or other places where we see thousands of people marching on the streets, as we see now in Israel, by the way. The opposition coming out and, maybe toppling Hamas or something like that. I think it will be premature to talk about some kind of movement in that scale. But what we can learn from these videos we see and from these demonstrations of opposition, we can learn that the control of Hamas in certain areas has weakened. I think this is what we can see from this, because we know last year, like really a year ago, was like January or February, after the major attack, the large scale attack of the IDF on Gaza, there've been protests against Hamas by certain groups. And there've been some groups of like strong men, semi-Gazan mafia groups that decided to oppose Hamas, and they created some kinds of autonomous zones in certain neighborhoods in certain areas. And what happened is that Hamas regained control of the population around March or April last year. And there were reports about that the IDF was seeing less demonstrations and less cases of civilians getting their hands on food supplies. And that was an indication that Hamas regained control of the population in Gaza. So today, when we see these demonstrations coming back again, we can understand that in certain areas, the control or grip of Hamas on the population is weakening. So I think if we're careful and we try not to use our wishful thinking too much, I think this is what we can say at this point of time.
If I'm a Gazan, Akiva, and I'm marching through the streets, I mean, I have to imagine if Hamas saw me doing this, that my life would be at risk. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm sure that when Hamas will regain control, if it does, in these areas, there will be consequences. But that's what we've seen in the past. That's what they just mentioned. Last year, that's what happened. So,
So
we
they
see here-
regained control. What happened to those people who were protesting once Hamas regained control?
Yeah, so I don't know the exact details about specific individuals or specific groups, but there have been gunfights, and Hamas has been executing people and detaining people all the time. So we can just assume what happened to those people. It didn't end up nicely for them, as we'll say.
So these people are brave. I mean, if they're doing this now, Kiva, then I'm assuming, on one hand, Hamas is weakened, like you're saying. Hesitantly we'll say it looks like there's a weakness in Hamas. Otherwise, they would unfortunately be killed. But they are, I guess, they're pinning their hopes on Israel. Is this connected?
Maybe they're pinning their hopes on Israel. Maybe they're thinking of other initiatives that are, in the air. Maybe return to the Palestinian Authority or others. Now, there's one thing we need to know. We need to understand about the Gazan society is that basically we do not understand them. We view the Gazans as like some kind of nationality, maybe like homogeneous bunch of people, maybe the way we tend to view ourselves. But the truth is, this is a very fractured society. It's built of different, tribes and families, hamulas, as you say in Arabic, and they have different interests and conflicts between them. It's like, the Hamas is maybe the strongest. He's like the boss mafia, but everybody else is different kinds of mafias, and they pledge alliance to Hamas at some point, and sometimes they have conflicts of interests, and they're very, very local. So part of this is also this, this complicated relationship between different fractions inside Gazan society, different families, different tribes. Some of them are different, different kinds of people. Some could be Bedouins, some could be, refugees, so-called, from Israel from 48. Some could be immigrants from Egypt. I mean, I'm not a expert on this, but this society is very, very complicated. So I'm sure part of this has to do with, a certain family that probably has a certain amount of power within Gazan society, at least, in their district. Let's say, I don't know, like a Sajaiya family with certain amount of control in their zone, their area, their territory, basically. So this has to do with the relationships between them and Hamas authorities. And so I'm not sure if, I for sure don't know, but I'm not sure if we, I mean, as a country, as the IDF, as intelligence apparatus, if we really know, what's going on exactly between these different fractions. So it's more complex than we know. And maybe, Hamas will regain control, but then he will have some kind of renegotiation of the power structure of these groups. And maybe that's what they're building on. Maybe they want to be, in a different position the day after, no matter what that day after might be. So it's more complicated than that. That's what I'm saying.
I wish that we had realized what you're saying on October 6th. I really do. And that the humility of not thinking that we are inside the Gazan mind and know what's happening is part of, what we call the conceptia for all these years. And I very much appreciate, and I believe our audience will as well, to see an expert of your caliber being humble. And within that, let's go back again to a year ago when we saw, as you mentioned, it was January, February 2024, when we saw, again, protests and there was a lot of hope out there. And then you uncovered or released a document that had been declassified, an IDF document, that said that, contrary to what the IDF was telling us at the time, that Jabalia and certain areas that control had been wrested from Hamas was back in control. And as you mentioned, we no longer saw demonstrations on the streets. And I'm assuming it's not just because all of these families are living in 5-star resorts, but because Hamas is in control. What happened between January, February 2024 until April that turn back the clock? Like, what happens so that Hamas regain control?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, because it's very important to understand what happened during the war. So in the first few months of the war, let's say till like mid-January or something like that, where the IDF was conducting its large-scale attack. They called it in Hebrew atzima. I don't know what the exact translation is. It's not really a word in Hebrew either, by the way, but it was like the large-scale attack where several divisions attacking mostly northern Gaza, Gaza City and its neighborhoods. And then what happened is that the IDF basically withdrew. They sent all the reserves home, and a small amount of forces were left to control the territory. And then Hamas reestablished its control. Now we need to understand what happened. We need to understand what was the way the IDF managed its operations. The IDF was trying. It kind of viewed Hamas as maybe a normal army, a standing army, and they were trying to. They called it lefarek. They called it to take apart or dissolve or make certain elements of the Hamas army non-functional. Okay, so they were not talking about destroying all of Hamas or killing all the operatives. The idea was to get a certain amount of devastation, of killing operatives, of catching a certain amount of munitions or tunnels or other strategic deposits, etc. And then at some point you can say that this organization is not operative as an organization anymore. We disrupted the organization. It doesn't exist as an organization. Mm-hmm. They say there were maybe individuals left, there's still terrorists, but as an organization, Hamas in these areas did not exist. And I think the best symbol of that was a speech Daniel Hagari, the IDF spokesman, gave. I think it was like February or something like that. Was kind of summarizing up the first stage of the war. And he said that that's what they were doing. He explained everything I just said. He explained, with a presentation and videos and stuff like that, how we dismantle the organizational capabilities of Hamas. And he gave an example, Jabalia. That he really emphasized Jabalia. And he talked about the Jabalia battalion, how we dismantled the battalion and we killed this amount of operatives and we captured so much and so much infrastructure and weaponry, etc., etc.
Just for our listeners, I just want to be clear that Jabalia is in northern Gaza, and that was one of the major staging grounds on October 7th that, correct me if I'm wrong, hit both Kfar Aza. I don't know if they did they also hit Be'eri? Jabalia, it's
I think it's a little bit more north.
So Kfar Aza and that area.
That's the northern, the northern part of Gaza. There's a refugee camp called Jabalia. It's a serious hornet's nest of Hamas. So they gave this example of Jabalia, how we dismantled Jabalia. And then what happens? Like around, we've been to Jabalia. There've been another 2 operations in Jabalia since. The first one, I think, was already in April or May. There was a big operation in Jabalia. After we had this major announcement that Jabalia battalion was dismantled and it doesn't exist anymore. So what happened is there was a misconception of the IDF on how the Hamas operates and what we need to do to really dismantle it. And it's not enough to dismantle it as so-called a standing army and to disrupt a certain amount of its capabilities, because Hamas is a terrorist organization that never was a real standing army, and they're not dependent on an organizational structure like the IDF. They fight from basically their home ground. I mean, the Jabalia battalion, the people who live in Jabalia. They're not recruited from all of Gaza, and they're not dependent on a line of communication or reinforcements and stuff like that. They're very local. They have their own tunnels, their own deposits, and they fight from those sections. So they don't really care about, command and control. So we killed the Jabalia, the brigade commander and other battalion commanders and whatever. They had all these different names. But, at the end of the day, the free guys sitting in a tunnel waiting for the tank to pass by, they don't really care. They don't need this command and control structure. And then what happened is, after IDF killed all these people and celebrated this, and we dismantled all these battalions, etc., etc. They're talking about like 24 battalions dismantled and whatever. But there were so many operatives who stayed in the field. And there were a lot of tunnels that were unharmed, and a lot of weapon caches and others, And once the IDF sent all the reservists home, and they were left with a small, a small force. Like the Nachal Brigade took the whole Netzarim corridor, which now two brigades take. Only one brigade. It's very small, and the whole northern of Gaza was basically got emptied out from IDF's soldiers. So the operatives who stayed in the field, they could regain control. They could reorganize, regain control, rebuild their structure, whatever they had to do. And that's what happened. And then again, in April or May, I forgot the exact date, we had to go again and have this big major Jabalia operation. And then in the summer, there's another Jabalia operation, a huge one for a long time. And there's always casualties in these places. And Beit Hanun was attacked in November. One of the first places attacked was Beit Hanun and Beit Lahi. They're the northern sections of Gaza, really next to Sderot and places like that. They were attacked and captured and dismantled. Everything was wonderful in the beginning of the war. But then during September and October, there were fierce fighting in these places and a lot of casualties for the IDF. The Nachal Brigade was fighting there, and they lost a lot of casualties. And the same thing happened. Once you withdraw, the Hamas operatives who stay in the field, they just regain control, reorganize. They're probably weaker than they were before, October 7th. They have less capabilities, less munitions. Obviously, they have less rockets, etc. We see that, but they're still able to resist. They're still able to cause damage to our soldiers, and definitely, which is most important, and now I'm reconnecting to our subject, they're still able to gain control of their own society. And that's what's important. And every place the IDF withdrew from, these people just regain control all over again. So that's exactly what happened.
So we're in the fourth. We've had 4 rounds now in Jabalia. I read your article where we were already, time has passed, where you wrote about the 3rd round in Jabalia, and now we've already had maybe 4 rounds. And one of the things you really talk about, and you mentioned it briefly here, is the tunnels, that we underestimated or looked at the tunnels as maybe simply a tactical issue, like a tactical nuisance. And I remember when I was in Zaytun with the IDF, and I saw in Zaytun, they blew up a tunnel. It was a big operation. I asked the commander, how many other tunnels are there? And he laughed. He said, they're everywhere. And I said, well, are we going to blow them all up? And this was maybe 2 months into the war. And it was, and it, almost like, no, of course not kind of look. What did we learn from this now? Do we still look at tunnels as if, apparently they went underground into the tunnels and hid and then just resurfaced. So what have we learned from that experience?
Yeah, so this is something the IDF learned during the war. Well, I can say roughly, until the war, the tunnels were viewed as mainly a threat if they support raids on Israel. Okay, tunnels let cross over the border. That was the main threat. It was taken care of after the what's called Tzuk Eitan, the 2014 operation in Gaza, and we built this underground wall. So we took care of that threat of the tunnels as a means of offense. And then in the beginning of the war, the tunnels were viewed not as a strategic holdout of the enemy, but more as a tactical threat. The soldiers, the units fighting inside Gaza were afraid people will pop up from tunnels and cause damage, cause casualties on their forces. So they did different things to cope with this tactical threat. So a lot of times, the IDF, they blew up houses or destroyed houses. A lot of times it was done because that was the only way to make sure nobody pops up from inside the house on the bottom floor. So if the house is collapsed, so whatever tunnel opening was in this house is unusable. So when the soldiers, when they move forward, they would collapse the houses behind them as a means of defending themselves from the tunnels. Most of the tunnel operations were viewed as something like this, at least at the beginning of the war. And it took a while for the IDF to understand that the tunnels were actually what's called in strategic language, it's in Hebrew you'll say merkaz koved. I just forgot the word in English for a minute, if you can help me recall. But that's like that's the strong point. That's where the enemy is. That's the enemy's strongholds you want to get control of. Okay, and that became a strategic thing that the IDF understood that it has to take care of. It's not only a tactical threat; it should be the goal of the operations. Okay, and the operation in Rafah, starting in May, viewed the tunnels as a strategic goal. That was the whole idea of regaining control of the Philadelphia corridor, was to cut the tunnels from Egypt into Gaza, and to take care of all the other tunnels there, because the understanding was that the Hamas was using the tunnels to for all its operations. I mean, that's where their headquarters are. That's where their food is, the munitions. Our people who were kidnapped or kept in the tunnels. So the tunnels were starting to be viewed as the goal of the operation. It's not only as a tactical threat, as you said.
And you had mentioned something on this point. I think you called it was in Hebrew, the balloon effect. Almost like if you press it, if you press it on one area, you squeeze a balloon, so the air moves to the other area. I mean, this was also very importantly a way for the terrorists to flee from one area to another area. And then when we went to the other area, they fled back to the original area. I mean, we know this also from Yahya Sinwar, right? I mean, Sinwar was simply moving around. And our hostages also report that they have been ferried from place to place to place to place, both in tunnels, above ground, inside of homes. And so I guess this was another consideration. However, even if a terrorist, if he flees to another area, if the IDF is not occupying and has a permanent position in the original area that they took over. I mean, if we are permanently in the original area, then I assume they wouldn't come back. But if we move on in our operations, there's always an opportunity to come back. How does this play into the whole idea of trying to destroy Hamas? I guess occupying, you called it occupying land, occupying territory, I should say. Yeah.
Right. So this is one of the failures of the beginning of the war, the first stages. Because the mindset of the idea of the strategic idea was to dismantle the Hamas as an organization, but not to destroy it totally. So they were moving from place to place and trying to attack these, the word I was looking for, by the way, is center of gravity. So they'll say there's a center of gravity in Shifa Hospital. That's one of the major operations in the beginning of the war. And most of the operations were aimed to get control of Shifa Hospital. So we had this attack on Shifa Hospital. It was a big raid, several brigades, done the whole thing, took everything out, and then they're done with this raid. And the idea was we kind of destroyed this center of gravity, so they move out. And then there's a different center of gravity someplace else, in Jabalia, so they move in Jabalia. But then in Zitun, so they move out and go to Zitun. So they were destroying these operational centers of the enemy, but not staying in the territory systematically. And then this is what one of the commanders I was talking to, he called the balloon effect. So we're going to Shifa, so everybody moves out of Shifa and they go to Jabalia. And then we go to Jabalia, so they move out of Jabalia and they go to whatever, El Atatra. And then, they move around. They see where the IDF is operating. And because they don't want to die, because that's what most people do, they just move around accordingly. There's always a certain force left, to cause casualties to the IDF, to have some battles, to have some resistance. But, the main force or the important people, they just move around in different sections. And The alternative for this should have been a systematic occupation of the land. Now, when we talk about occupation, we're not talking about occupation in a political mean, that you occupy the territory and then we'll stay or reestablish our settlements, whatever. We're talking about occupation in the military means that it means that you stay in the territory you gained. That's what it means. So if, let's say, the war was conducted differently and the IDF would have started from north towards south, and systematically every neighborhood or every zone that the IDF took control of, it doesn't leave it. It just continues moving forward and pressing forward, and the territory behind would have been empty from most of the civilians and from the Hamas operatives. So you could have gone to a situation where this balloon effect didn't happen. But as it happened, they were just attacking different sections of the Gaza city, and the Hamas operatives are moving from one place to another. We should call them terrorists, not operatives. For some reason, I got used to that word. But the Hamas terrorists, they just moved from one neighborhood to another according to the IDF's attack. Now, if you look at the attack on Rafah, and before that, the way the IDF handled the Netzarim corridor, you can see there was some kind of change of strategy. Because in the Netzarim corridor, IDF decided they're going to stay. And they were going to stay, and they wanted to widen the corridor. So it started out as a road. I don't know if you've been there at some point during the war, but it's a pretty narrow road. And the mission was to control the road and defend it. And they were thinking maybe we can defend it, 200 meters from each side or something like that. And then it turned out to be a big, wide corridor. It was, I think, like 10 kilometers wide or something like that. It's really a square, not a corridor. It's very, very wide, and everything inside this corridor was destroyed. No houses, no infrastructure, no people, no civilians, nothing. And eventually, I think also no tunnels. They took care of most of the tunnels in that area. So the idea was that if you control this territory, it should be emptied from population and from Hamas terrorists.
Right. It's just important to add here again. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Akiva. Just for our audience, the Netzarim corridor bisects the Gaza Strip. It divides the Gaza Strip completely, and part of the idea was, and still is, because the first thing we did when we went back in was to reoccupy the Netzarim corridor, is to prevent pretty much what we're talking about, a flow of people from north to south. Right. So it's above ground. You can't cross above ground. And like you said, hopefully they've eliminated most of the tunnels so that at least you partition Gaza into north and south. Right.
Right. That's the idea. The idea was to isolate the certain areas so they can't reinforce each other or run away or stuff like that. This didn't really work. I'll talk about this in a minute. I just want to finish this description. And the same happened in the attack on Rafah, that they started with the Philadelphia corridor, and then they winded, the IDF moved northward, systematically getting control of more territory, destroying anything in it, the houses, the tunnels, whatever. No population in these zones. And that wherever an IDF got to, it planned on staying, and they stopped moving around. So that was a change of strategy that the people in the IDF figured out at some point. And I got the feeling that this was the idea in the Jabalia attack around September, October, that again, it was systematic, trying to empty out these areas from terrorists and most of the population. But of course, because of the ceasefire and the deal we got with the Trump administration, so we withdrew out of these areas. So maybe this goal did not really happen as it was planned. There's one thing you said about the population moving. This is also a problem in this war. The IDF always tells the population in advance where we're going to attack, and it asks the population to move. Right? We see this all the time. This is done for humanitarian reasons, and it's you can understandably. But what happens is when you tell your enemy exactly what your moves are going to be, that the enemy knows your moves in advance, and first of all they can prepare, the land before we come in, which is dangerous.
With
But also
landmines and explosives. Yeah.
landmines, explosive, exactly. Ambushes, whatever they do, and also they flee with the population. So when in the beginning of the war, we told everybody to move southward from Gaza City to, it's called the Muasi. It's like the south and western area of Gaza Strip. So a lot of the Hamas terrorists moved there. The leading ones, their families. Some of our prisoners were kidnapped, probably moved with the population, and we didn't really have the means to see who's coming through, who's a terrorist, who's not. Obviously, the women are all covered, and if there's thousands of them every day, it's impossible to see. Maybe it's a terrorist who disguises himself as a woman, maybe it's one of the hostages. It was really was a problem. So this is also something they have to deal with. And at some point, the idea was to move the population through some kind of checkpoints. And then we have a video camera that we can take pictures of everybody. And because our intelligence is pretty sophisticated, they thought they can do face recognition of the people just moving through this checkpoint. And then, something will pop up in the computer and then it will detain a certain individual. This was the idea. On the second attack of Jabalia, it didn't happen because at the end of the day, the people from Jabalia just moved to different neighborhoods of Gaza. They didn't move southwards because of this balloon effect. But I'm just saying this was one of the things the IDF realized throughout the war, that when we move the population, we need to make sure there's ways of monitoring this population and to see who's moving in and out and who we're talking about. So this is also one of the things that was learned.
This is, what you're saying is part of the irony of the situation, that you have protesters marching in the streets of major capitals in the world and on university campuses that Israel is supposedly committing some type of genocide in Gaza. What army, if it's committing genocide, A, moves the civilian population, B, informs the civilian population that you're going to be attacking, knowing that the terrorists who are with them are getting away? I mean, it's I think part of the reason, in addition to the anti-Semitism in the world, why we are being blamed is no one can believe this is true, because no one in the history of warfare has ever done this. Moved the civilian population, alerted them, and along with them, the enemy that we're going to be attacking. And so therefore, someone who doesn't know anything about Israel says, it can't be true. But, we know it is true.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we're going into so many measures to defend the civilian population. We didn't talk even about the humanitarian aid, which is strategically important. We should talk about this before the end of this conversation. But we're going into all these measures, and it does seem. I assume you're right. I mean, people don't believe this is really what's happening, and don't believe that the civilian casualties that you see reported have to do more with the way Hamas controls the population, the way they operate inside the population, than the way the IDF operates accordingly towards the population. I mean, when we bomb Yahya Sinwar or Muhammad Def or whatever was hiding, with the kids and inside dense population, so they're to blame for that. So yeah, this is obviously one of the major issues with the way this war is viewed and reported. And I think a lot of people who've been on the ground and saw what the IDF was actually doing understood the truth of the matter. But we're talking here about a strategic military point of view, and this caused a lot of problems for the IDF because the terrorists were running away, because you give advance notices about your intentions. There's a serious restraints for operations. It's a serious problem now. I'm not saying I have a solution. I don't know if we could surprisingly attack a city with a million populated with a million civilians. I don't know if it should have been the right thing to do. Especially the way the world views us and the Biden administration, etc.
And the optics, right? In World War II, there was no problem doing that. I mean, in World War II, the Allies and, they clearly, the amount of civilians that were killed are astronomical compared to combatants, as opposed to
Yeah,
today when,
that's
even if we take their numbers, which of course are not true, it's 1-to-1, which is, one of the lowest probably in any war. Well, let me ask you, Akiva, because this is really, I think, the convergence point between the optics and the tactics, right? The optics, in order to, not only optics, it's to try to prevent humanitarian casualties. We're fighting in a war in a way that to some degree is not the way to win the war. And if holding land, if occupying land militarily is necessary, my first question is why does there appear to be that there was hesitance? I mean, it's always attributed to Herzl Levy, but the former chief of staff, but why was there hesitance to occupy land from the very beginning? And have we, now that we have re-entered Gaza, have we learned from that mistake?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think the main, I mean, if you analyze the actions of the IDF, okay, this will not be the formal explanation they were giving, but this is what I understand from analyzing the way the IDF operated and from, bits and pieces of statements. They were thinking that if we operate in this way of attacking the enemy's organizational structure and dismantling Hamas, making it a non-functional organization, the idea was this will put pressure on Hamas to release the hostages. Okay, these were operations that were aimed at some kind of hostage deal.
So not a victory. They were aimed at pressuring the enemy, but they were not aimed at being victorious, the destruction of Hamas. Okay.
Yeah, that's the only explanation I can see. And now you see the Herzl Levy, the more the time passed, they were talking about this, if formally. I mean, this war, this is one of the problems with the war, is that we had two war aims that kind of contradict, or at least they don't always, harmonize together. One of our goals was to destroy Hamas. And the second goal was to, release our captives, release the hostages. Okay, now, if you want to release the hostages, so it turns out that the best way probably would be through some kind of deal with Hamas, right? That's what we see. That was the assumption of most people in the IDF also, already in the beginning of the war. If you destroy Hamas, so you have no one to do a deal with. Right? I mean, it doesn't work together. Now, Hamas knows that. And Hamas always threatens to kill hostages. And we've seen this happening in Rafah. They killed 6 hostages. They're using the hostages as some kind of weapon. And therefore, when the first operational plans of the IDF, you kind of like stuck. What you want to do? You could have said, okay, we're going to destroy Hamas. It would probably mean that some of our hostages will be executed or will be killed in action. And this is a result we're willing to accept, because strategically destroying Hamas is way more important than the hostages. This could have been a strategic decision. It's the strategic decision. I think strategically that was the right decision to make. But they can understand why Netanyahu or any other government could not make this decision, which basically means, kind of they give up the hostages. If we can release them, we release whatever we can. But, we're going to destroy Hamas, and the hostages will be just like a secondary consideration. But what happened is that the IDF was operating with this, there's always like, a second eye on the hostages. We want the hostages back. And then they're thinking about putting pressure on Hamas and leverage on Hamas to free the hostages in different ways. So we had all these operations, a lot of special ops, a lot of interrogations, trying to realize where the hostages are. Maybe certain fractions of Hamas or Islamic Jihad will crack and they will give away their hostages they have. And there's always this hope that the military operations will end out with some kind of leverage that will end with hostage release. And that's why the operations were run, not as an operation to reoccupy the Gaza Strip systematically, hold on to the land where you are, and taking a responsibility on the population. Because at the end of the day, if you occupy the territory, you gain responsibility on the population. It's a known, it's known in war. There's military control of certain areas. The IDF has this operation to control the occupied territory. There's the military police. There's military governors. There are certain laws regarding to this, because this is part of every military operation. And again, I'm saying I'm not talking about...
It's the rules of war. This is the rules of war. The occupying power then has responsibility over the population it occupies. It's war. This is not a political statement. Yeah, it's a military statement.
And we're not talking about...
It's happened in every single war that's ever taken place. Someone is occupied.
Right. We're not talking about reestablishing itnachliyot or whatever, settlements. It's just the practice of war. And the IDF didn't do that. That's why they moved from place to place, and we had this balloon effect. And the idea was, hopefully, this some kind of, this basically like large-scale raids. That's what it was. That these raids on the Hamas strongholds will end up with Hamas kind of like, caving, giving in, and releasing hostages. Now, you probably noticed that a lot of the hostages released in these deals, like now, just in the past few weeks, a lot of them been in the northern part of Gaza, where supposedly the IDF held a major attack between, November and January. So that was very surprising. After all this big, large-scale attack, it was like 3 divisions of the IDF, full divisions in full power, and there's still hostages in there, and they're being released in northern Gaza. It was just crazy to witness that.
Well, it goes back, I think, Akiva, to what you're saying. If a soldier needs to carry out an order, and his commander needs to carry out an order, and his commander needs to carry out an order, an order is essential to understand a goal. If there's no clear goal, then you're fighting with one arm tied behind your back, which is what it sounds like this has been. Again, we understand the sensitivity of the hostages, but the whole kind of fable that you can both get back the hostages and destroy Hamas simultaneously is not true. And one can say, well, look, it's worked, but it hasn't worked, because the war has gone on now for a year and a half, and we have 800 plus soldiers that have also been killed. And so we can't delude ourselves. And maybe I'm thankful I don't have to be the one to make that decision, but from a strategic military point of view, and when you're dealing with a country of 10 million people that you have to protect, it seems like that decision it should be clear. I think, in fact, the Trump administration, at least at certain times, has tried to direct Israel to that conclusion. And therefore, so if we're back in Gaza now, and we're realigning ourselves, and we've recruited a lot of reservists right now. My friends are in reserves. Divisions have been moved back into Gaza. We're reforming our southern divisions. Do you think it's going to be different this time?
Yeah, well, I certainly hope so. And from what I understand, the plans now are different, and the idea is to wage more of a siege warfare on Hamas, which is that's the most important issue in this war is the aid, the humanitarian aid, so-called, which is not humanitarian aid. It's basically resupplying the Hamas. That's what's happening. Everybody knows it. The aid coming into Gaza is going straight to Hamas hands, almost from day one. I mean, since the beginning, since the first hostage deal in December of 2023, that's where Hamas actually they gave in, and they were willing to make a deal. But the deal was they get humanitarian supplies. And once we did that, we lost the main leverage we had on Hamas. That's why they agreed to that deal, because there was a siege on Gaza. They were running out of resources in their tunnels, and most of all, they had to have gasoline and oil to run their electricity facilities, because in the tunnels you have to have there's a whole system of pumps so you can breathe inside these tunnels. They run by electricity, and putting in gas to Gaza, that was one of the main issues that Hamas wanted in that first ceasefire and the hostage deals. And that was one of the things that caused most of the problems, because now the Hamas has what they need. They need these supplies. That's all they care about, because then they can survive in their tunnels. So that's the main issue. And the humanitarian aid we moved in also now in this deal, and also beforehand, it was just going into Hamas's hands. People serving in Gaza, I've seen this. I mean, some of it has been published to the public, but you could see videos of these truckloads coming in. These convoys of trucks coming in with food, with medical supplies, whatever, clothing, whatever it is, and you see Hamas terrorists, shooting the civilians, kicking them away from these trucks, and escorting the trucks to their deposits. So they take control totally of all this so-called humanitarian aid, and basically we were resupplying our enemy. That's what was happening. Now Hamas, some of it was also selling to the population and making money, a lot of money, a lot more than the Qatarian money that everybody's talking about, that Netanyahu allowed Qatar to give Hamas. We're talking about millions and millions a month, like 100 million a month or something like that, from selling this humanitarian aid. So Hamas was able to resupply itself, to refinance himself from this aid. And that's how reestablished their apparatus in Gaza now. I mean, they're weaker because they're maybe younger and they don't have all these rockets and all the munitions they used to have, but they definitely reestablished their control using the aid we've been giving them. So if you ask me, that's the main issue here, is we should stop, and we did stop supplying Hamas. Now we will stop supplying Hamas at some point. Hamas also might break. This could lead to a breaking point, because they cannot last forever. So this is a big issue. So as you said, we're kind of waging a weird war because of the hostages, but our war was also being run in this weird way when we're supplying our enemy, while we're fighting him, and during the battles, like the same day, we could bomb a place in, I don't know, in Nutzirat, and the same evening there'll be a convoy of trucks driving through our lines and resupplying the enemy in Nutzirat. So it's like,
it's crazy. Basically, the currency in Gaza right now is the food, medicine, and fuel. And what you've just explained, which I think is incredibly eye-opening and upsetting, is that we make these deals in order to get our hostages back, but the fuel goes in to power generators that sends air and electricity to Hamas in the tunnels in which they're holding our hostages.
Right.
I mean, it's crazy. You get a few hostages, they get then fuel to survive in the tunnels with our existing hostages and make money and rearm and re-equip. So when you talk about the potential fall of Hamas, and with this, I want to kind of bring this to a conclusion, because I know that you have a lot going on. When we see these uprisings, or not uprisings, these demonstrations in Gaza, I wouldn't yet call it an uprising. We don't see people taking arms and fighting against Hamas, but I think in the stages of looking at a civilian rebellion, the first is a demonstration, and then if they feel more confident, they can then pick up arms, and the clans can then engage and accelerate the fall of Hamas. Do you feel like there is a way that these, I know it's just the very beginning, this trickle could turn into something that could accelerate the fall from Hamas? And how could the IDF and perhaps other governments around the world aid this?
Yeah, so as you probably noticed, I'm from the skeptic party on this issue. I don't know how serious this could get, and how strong these clans are to fight Hamas. Hamas is well armed, and it's well established to control society and to punish people and to wage terror on their own society. So I wouldn't rely my hopes on this. I mean, it doesn't seem to me like a solid strategy. This could happen, hopefully. I wish it would happen, but I wouldn't count on that. That's the truth. We should continue fighting Hamas, continue the siege, maybe even have cut off electricity or something like that. They can enhance the siege on Hamas, continue the pressure. One of the main issues is how many Gazans are going to leave the Gaza Strip. That's a strategic issue. We didn't really talk about that, but that's very important. And we'll see how the Trump plan will happen at the end, if it does. But I don't have really high hopes from these specific groups. As I said, a lot of it is like internal, divisions and internal politics. You don't really, understand. And when the way we unite when we're attacked by an external enemy, I assure you, these guys unite when they're attacked by an external enemy. So nobody in Gaza, no matter what the intrigues they have between each other, they will not fight alongside the IDF against Hamas. I mean, it sounds to me kind of like a far reach. It does, as I said, it is an indication that Hamas is weakening, at least in these areas where this is happening. Okay, so maybe some kind of hope that someone else could control certain areas, once we occupy them or something like that. Maybe this is what you can see from this. But I would not, count strategically of, winning strategy for the war, some kind of the Gazan rebellion. I wouldn't count on that.
So it's very good to hear this, Akiva. I'll tell you why. Even if I was hoping for it, it's very important, and I felt this in speaking with you throughout this conversation is incredibly valuable because you're a realist, and it's very sobering. If I summarize, there's going to be no replacement for the IDF to be aiming for complete victory. We're not going to be able to think that we can understand what's happening inside all of the kind of fragmented and different ethnicities and different power concerns in Gaza. We're going to need to take a siege over the land and hold the territory and militarily occupy that territory, reduce humanitarian aid, which we know that right now there is enough humanitarian aid in Gaza, if it was distributed equally in any case, to uphold the population for months. But we have to stop that because that is what's giving power to Hamas. And what I hope will lead us into the next discussion with you is really the idea that the IDF needs to have a very clear goal of what it's doing. And that brings me back, and I'll just throw out a notification for everybody listening to this, is that you really have produced the most compelling and thorough research and really outtake for anybody that wants to understand what happened on October 7th, what the failures were. And I would love to explore that more with you. And I think our audience would as well, because it's only been put out in Hebrew. And it is the most thorough assessment yet. And people in Israel are learning from it. So I want people around the world to learn from it. So I hope you'll agree to come back with us, Akiva. This has been absolutely fascinating. And thank you for joining the True East podcast.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be glad to come back. It's very interesting also to me, and I'll be glad to share these findings with everybody else. So yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.